Good day, everyone. So nice to have you all here. I'm Dr. Pamela Crisco. I am a founding board member of the Psychedelic Association of Canada, and I'm honored that you're joining us for this webinar that I think you will find incredibly interesting. First off, I want to acknowledge that I come to you on the unceded territory of the Klahoose First Nations in British Columbia, and I'm very honored that I get to live and play and work where I am. I also want to give a big hearty thank you to all our volunteers at the Psychedelic Association of Canada. This organization is 99% volunteer driven, and tonight Gordon and Leah are our support crew, so big thank yous to both of you for helping us out tonight, and again to all the volunteers that make the Psychedelic Association of Canada such a great organization, coast to coast to coast and across the world. So I am so thrilled about this webinar. This is an area that has not been discussed enough in the psychedelic ecosystem. I was very privileged to meet Neil Woods last year in the UK, and within a few words coming out of his mouth about what he was interested in, I knew this was somebody I wanted to talk to a lot more, and I'm so glad we are. Neil is a former police officer. He is in the UK right now where it's midnight. So thank you, Neil, so much for staying up late and being with us. I'm so glad you're here. And with that, let you introduce yourself. And for everyone, Neil's gonna really enlighten us here for about 45 minutes or so, and then we're gonna open it up to Q&A. So thank you, Neil, for staying up so late, and let me hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Pam, and hello, everybody. Thank you for joining and deciding to listen to this today. Yeah, I'll give you a little bit more background about myself. So I'm a former undercover police officer from the UK. So I used to catch drug dealers for a living, and I used to do it by the sneakiest and most covert means, working undercover. So I spent many years infiltrating some of the more dangerous drug dealing gangs in the UK. And I realized eventually, I was a bit slow on the uptake, but I realized eventually that all of the work that I was doing was only causing harm, not just to vulnerable individuals that I was manipulating, but also to the communities in which I operated and to society as a whole, both nationally and internationally. That's quite a grand statement, but I think hopefully by the end of the next 45 minutes, I can explain some of my thinking with that. So I resigned. I had a mental health crisis. So I'm diagnosed with chronic complex PTSD and moral injury. And I resigned. I went through a sort of a mental health crisis, but really I resigned because I knew that I didn't belong in the police anymore, and that I knew I needed to do something in order to improve the situation around the world. So since about 2014, I've been a drug law reform activist, and I do identify as an activist more than an advocate, although of course I am also an advocate. I have been campaigning as part of the international movement of other police and law enforcement professionals who see things the same way as I do. I've been campaigning as part of that movement since then. And I'm now a member of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, which is based in the USA. And we are, I suppose, the leaders of that movement. I'm a board member of the LEAP in the USA, but I'm also chair of the organization in Europe. Now, I've been campaigning on many aspects of drug policy, so particular harm reduction, especially within the opioid markets and opioid policy. I've been campaigning on human rights. I've been campaigning on trying to reduce the power of organized crime, all the different facets of drug law reform, all of the reasons why we need to do it. I've been doing this for many years. And my advocacy is at all sorts of different levels. So I do events at the United Nations in Vienna. I do lots of university lectures. So I was speaking for the criminology department of Manchester University yesterday. I've travelled all over. I've been very privileged, I suppose, to travel all over the world to speak on these topics, from the University of Cape Town to or Wrocław in Poland, all lots and lots of different places. Although I don't really, it's hardly a glamorous lifestyle because I don't really see much of a country. As an activist, you only ever see airports and hotels. Um, but the point that I've been asked to speak about today is not the general drug law reform topics. And I'd give a little bit of background how I've got into this, talking about the climate crisis. So, at an event at the United Nations, I met an activist called Clemmy James. And Clemmy, someone I admire a great deal, but she wanted to speak to me because Clemmy's a hero of mine. She, as a student, actually hijacked a coal train with a group of people in a sort of environmental activist cell. She spent months casing it, and they actually successfully hijacked this coal train, which was delivering coal to a coal-fired power station. So a noble act in my mind. But she was arrested at the point when that happened because her team was infiltrated by an undercover police officer. So what brought Clemmy to me was the desire to understand the motivations of undercover policing and just to understand and unpick, what happened and talk it through with somebody that she knew had the profile of being an undercover cop, but it was now an activist. So Clemmy and I hit it off like a house on fire. We got on so well. We're both complete geeks with drug policy and all things activism. And so we spent many hours talking and in comparing notes as to how we saw things, especially with her from her environmental background, me with my background, and I had a particular specialism. I do have a particular specialism talking about corruption caused by organized crime. That we realized the importance of this intersection between drug law reform and the climate crisis and climate justice. And we spent a great deal talking. And you know what it's like when you meet somebody you can bounce ideas off, and you go through that process where it actually helps you think, and it raises more questions. And there's always more questions, as Pam's just been saying as we were chatting just before this webinar. It's true. There's always more questions. We should always look for those questions. And so Clemmy and I decided to find out who else was working in this space, who else can provide evidence and answer those questions. And Clemmy's been the leader on this. She's been the person who's found most of these people, incredible brains like Professor Kendra McSweeney, who's a professor in Ohio State University in the USA. We've got lots of people from Brazil, Colombia, Myanmar, all over the world, India, Pakistan. And Clemmy has assembled this huge coalition, including organizations such as SOS Amazonia. We've got people in our coalition from Global Witness. Clemmy and I spoke at the Greenpeace stage in Glastonbury last year. So the topic is gathering pace, but I think I'm probably getting a little bit ahead of myself because I haven't really explained how this intersection works yet from our perspective. But I wanted to set the scene really because this is the cutting edge of drug policy. This is the issue which is emerging and that is turning out to be, I would argue, the most important thing that us as a movement should be working on. And the fact that we should be aiming to be one movement, the environmental activist movement, our comrades who do that work, needs to be the same movement as the drug law reform movement. And so after I've explained a few things and talked to you a bit more at the end of this session today, what I'm going to ask of all of you is, for those that are involved in anything to do with the environmental crisis, the climate crisis, or if you know somebody who is, or if you know an activist, or you know someone who knows an activist, I'm going to ask you to please disseminate this information and share. I've already sent some links that you can get access to. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself, and I'll start back at the beginning for me, because the beginning for me in this puzzle in this issue is where I became obsessed with corruption. And obsessed is not too strong a word. I did. So when I used to work undercover, I would, after I got established doing it, I would travel around the UK, and I would work in an inner city area for about 6 or 7 months. And the format of the sort of operation I would do is I would uh, go into an inner city area. I would look for the most vulnerable people in that city centre, people who were living on the periphery of life, the really truly marginalised people, the problematic heroin and crack cocaine users, people who were homeless or living in squats or on the periphery of that kind of community. And I would look for the most vulnerable person because, well, vulnerable people are the easiest to manipulate. And if that sounds ruthless, well, yeah, of course it's ruthless. That is the nature of the work that I used to do. In fact, you could say that ruthlessness is an essential part of drugs policing per se, completely, because it follows the idea that we can cause harm to vulnerable individuals in order to get information, in order to catch the gangster, catch the drug dealer at the end of the operation. And I was on the front line of that because I was using my skills that I'd developed over a long period of time to successfully manipulate people and to stay alive in dangerous situations as well. So I would look for these dangerous people. And in one particular operation in the city of Nottingham, it was a particularly high pressure job because at the beginning of that operation, there was lots of shootings between an infamous gang called the Bestwood Cartel, run by a very infamous British gangster called Colin Gunn, who was essentially at war with everybody. So there was lots of pressure for me to find out information about the shootings, the murders, and it was a particularly dangerous time on the streets of Nottingham. After about 4.5 months into this operation, I finally got an introduction to this sort of lieutenant of from the Bestwood Cartel, a guy called Stitz. And when I got when I got introduced to him, he turned up in a car, and it was the most bizarre, almost a dark comedy sketch because he turned up and this guy brought his 12-year-old son with him. And his 12-year-old son was dressed up in exactly the same way as him. So they both had the same two-piece tracksuit. They both had the identical Nike Air Max trainers, which really was part of the uniform of gangsters in the early 2000s. They had the same gold chain, the same shaved head, the same sort of body language, the strut. And I don't know whether he just brought his son along because he was, I don't know, maybe it was bring your child to work with Daddy Day. I don't know, but he brought him along and he proceeded to show off about how tough Daddy was, I think. And what that meant was that he interrogated me with a knife pressed into my groin, which was most uncomfortable. It made conversation quite difficult, certainly from my perspective. It really, feeling that cold blade there is not something I ever want to feel again. But after being interrogated for what seemed like an eternity, which was probably closer to 10 minutes, he eventually decided that I was safe enough to sell to. So he sold to me, but then this is quite late at night, and I had to start early the next morning because of some other arrangements I'd made on the operation. So the next morning, I went to the safe location. I was fairly exhausted. I've been running on adrenaline, and cortisol had been interrupting my sleep, etc. And the next morning, so I should set the scene for you, really, what the safe location means. So it was an undercover operation, so it doesn't run from a police station. It runs like a terrorist cell. It runs completely separate from normal policing. And in fact, at the beginning of an operation, all of the backup team, all of my team that was assembled around me would be given what's called a lawful order, an instruction that they are not allowed to ask me my real name, not allowed to ask me where I'm from or any personal details, and that they would be disciplined if they did. So I was using the same pseudonym amongst my police colleagues as I was to the people on the streets, which is actually quite a lonely place to be honest. But all of those systems were set up to protect me clearly from corruption. But those rules were broken the next morning because two of my team had gone off sick and they brought in two new cops. Now, this really spooked me because it was against the rules. But I met the first one, shook his hand. I had no problem with him. The next one, I shook his hand and the hairs just went up on the back of my neck. This guy was wrong. Instinctively, my amygdala was just telling me, do not trust this guy. So I went to the senior investigating officer, the guy running it, and I said, look, boss, I am not going out on the streets today if that guy knows what I'm doing. I'm just not doing it. I don't trust him. And he said, no problem at all. I wasn't happy about this either. It's not how it's meant to happen. They don't know anything about the job. They've not been in the briefing. I can get rid of them. Don't worry. We'll just run short-handed. That's what we should have done anyway. So I was happy. I was reassured. I put it out of my mind. I carried on for a few months. It was a successful operation, about 56 people arrested. But then 12 months later, when Colin Gunn was brought down, eventually, it turned out that that police officer I'd taken an exception to was an employee of Colin Gunn. He was a member of the cartel. But he hadn't been corrupted as a police officer. He'd been paid to join the police. He was paid £2,000 a month on top of his police wages, plus bonuses for good information. And he'd been in the police for 7 years by the time I met him. There was some suspicion that he'd provided information which had led to murders, although that was never proven. And when he was sentenced for the judge sentenced him for 7 years, a year for every year that he'd been in the police. That probably didn't reflect the amount of damage or harm that he'd actually caused to people. Now, I'd had many sniffs and many indications up to that point in my undercover work of the suspicion of corruption and the hint of corruption. And it always sort of haunted the work that I did. But this is hard to argue with. This is very, very clear. But in the debrief for that, I met a very senior covert police officer in England, and he said, look, Woodsy, we know this happens. Of course this happens. With this much money involved, how can it not happen? And that was the attitude of this senior police officer. Now, I've spoken about this kind of thing, and there's this specific cases, in fact, with senior cops all over the world. And there is, amongst police leadership, for the ones that know and understand and are privy to internal intelligence, there is a general understanding and acceptance that that drugs organized crime will inevitably infiltrate and does infiltrate policing. It's accepted, completely accepted and understood. But my colleagues, normal police officers, have no idea of the extent of corruption. They don't know. It would help if it was understood. Now, I say this having already described to you the systems that are in place or were in place to try and protect me. I have to point out to you, and this is an important point, that those safeguards of that covert operation, my colleagues not being even allowed to know my real name, all of those safeguards are to protect me from that corruption that, of course, is accepted, exists. But none of those safeguards exist for any other kind of operation. They only exist for covert drugs operations, because the threat from corruption doesn't exist for anything else, because there isn't the value that could pay for that level of corruption in any other form of criminality. This is important. And the value that can be spent on corruption is really, really important, because taken together, all of the drug markets together, if you see it as one business, it's the fourth or fifth biggest business in the world. In terms of value, it's bigger than textiles. And we're all wearing textiles, right? So it's an enormous business which is unregulated and untaxed. But it's not just the value in the drug markets which is the problem. It's not just this huge wealth that causes the corruption. It's actually the mechanism by which we try and police the drug markets. It's not just the existence of prohibition which creates this wealth. It's also the mechanisms by which we try and deal with the policy of prohibition. And what I mean is the way that police aggressively police it. Let me explain what I mean by the mechanisms. So, say, and this is very broad brushstroke. It's just to explain it. It's not an accurate description. This is a sort of theoretical thought experiment to help you see what I mean. Say the police arrest a heroin dealer who controls half of the heroin supply in Ottawa, say, and that. Although, of course, we're talking North America, it's not going to be heroin, is it? It's going to be something synthetic. It's going to be fentanyl instead. Prohibition, eh? Thank you, Prohibition. But say the police catch this dealer who controls half of the opioid supply of the city of Ottawa. Normally, when the police arrest a kingpin character or arrest a gang or do a big police seizure or arrest of people, there are various net effects of that. One net effect is that there is an increase in violence, because where you create a gap in the market, you are creating a lucrative opportunity. And that lucrative opportunity is often fought over by two or more actors who want to take control. And sometimes they will do that with violence. So, and this is noted in police intelligence all over the world, but it's another piece of information that would be useful for the public to understand. It would be useful if the police didn't keep this information secret and they actually shared with the public that a net effect of police activity in a drug market is an increase in violence. If only the public knew. So there is often a fight over that gap in the market. Sometimes consumption goes up because two or more actors don't compete with violence, they compete with price drops. They have a price war, which actually increases consumption. Another net effect of that police activity in the drug market is an increase in overdoses. You know, we can prove this now, actually, because Professor Brandon Del Pozo of Brown's University in the US did a study about 18 months ago, which proved that police activity in an opioid market can lead, an arrest of a dealer can disrupt it and lead to an increase in overdoses. So these are the net effects. What we do know is a net effect of that police activity is never a reduction in the size of the market. The size of the market stays the same. It stays the same, and we need to see it in those economic terms to understand what's going on properly. But I'm jumping around a little bit. I'll return to my original point. If the police catch a dealer or gang who controls half of the fentanyl supply in the city of Ottawa, yeah, there might be a war, there might be a turf war, but actually the person who has the resources, or the gang that has the resources to take advantage of that opportunity, that is most likely to be able to take up that opportunity and take control of that size of the market, is the person or gang that controls the other half already, because they have the resources in place, they have the systems in place, they have the finances in place. So over time, what we have done with our law enforcement response to prohibition is that we've created monopolies, or we've created cooperatives. And if anyone is a fan of The Wire, the cooperative storyline explains it brilliantly. And in fact, that is based on actually what happened in Baltimore. Organized crime adapt to everything that policing does. But the growth of monopolies is one of the most important adaptations. And there are various examples of this growth of monopolies or cooperatives around the world. So, for example, only a couple of years ago, the National Crime Agency in the UK weirdly made this announcement, which I say weirdly because it's the kind of information that they normally just keep to themselves. But they actually announced publicly that for the first time, Dutch and British organised crime were working with the Italian mafia, organisations which previously had been at odds with each other, but they had become a cooperative. There's also been intelligence declaration sort of announcements or press releases from law enforcement agencies about the impact of West Balkans organised crime as well. and the fact that the West Balkans organised crime stepping into the international drug markets, not only have they monopolised, but they've also shortened supply routes as a product of that monopolisation. In other words, they've taken out the middleman, they've taken out the middle traffickers, and they've gone much more to the source, so that increasingly the people making the money at the end of the supply chain are the people who are actually have the capability for wholesale purchase at the beginning of the supply chain. So the whole supply chain has been shortened. This is a feature of this sort of monopolization that's been created by policing, the thinning out of the competition. It's also important to note, I think, that at every level around the world, the police informant system, this sort of shady trading of information, is used often by organized crime to get the police to get rid of rivals. So over time, we've created these monoliths, these huge, powerful organizations. Another example of this is a good example is the Mexican cartels. So there used to be many different drug dealing gangs in Mexico, but now there are 3 super cartels, very powerful. And the reason that there are 3 super cartels is because that's the natural development of the drug market as a result of aggressive, militarized, in fact, policing. Because the response is to become militarized. The response is to work together as a large gang. And however that hierarchy sort of takes shape, whether it's by design from individuals or kingpin characters, it's still, as a result, or it is an adaptation to policing, both national and international. Now, I mentioned the Mexican cartels for another reason, because it's important to note that those super cartels in Mexico have a bigger GDP than most West African countries. And that's a really important point, because what's happened with this monopolization is that organized crime entities or individuals or whoever, whatever place somebody has in the network of transnational organized crime, have increased their power. And what I mean by that is that if you have become a monopoly, you have increased your share of the market, then you have increased your share of the income. That means that you have more disposable income. Now, if you look at it in sort of normal business terms, where you develop a business strategy and you develop your profit and your business development strategy, in a legitimate company, you seek to have money to invest to expand, and it's the same with organized crime. If you increased your share of the market through this monopolization, you have more disposable income. Now, let me make this really clear. When organized crime have more disposable income, they always, and I mean always, invest it in corruption, because corruption is the most important part of the business model. Corruption allows organized crime to be protected from law enforcement, to be protected from the criminal justice system. It gives an edge over rivals. It's a way of reducing running costs to make the business more efficient. It's the most important part of the whole game. It makes you more secure. And so, by this method, by this policing and refining of organized crime, this sort of making organized crime more effective, more ruthless too, because in this refining process, police are constantly thinning out the competition for them, and it's making it more monopolized, more powerful. Part of that adaptation is also an increase in ruthlessness and violence, because in this sort of information trading that I've just referred to, the use of police informants, that creates it creates violence as a transactional as part of the transaction. Violence becomes the commodity, because when a police informant, and police informants are the most important part of police investigating in the drug markets. When that police informant is sat in a cell and they're thinking, oh my God, I'm looking at 10 years, I'm going to have to give them some information. Who can I grass up? Who can I give them information on? Because the police informant knows they can get 3 years off a 10-year sentence by giving some good information to the police. So this creates this constant transaction of information. But that informant's thinking, well, I can't give them that person because I know that if they even suspect that I've given information, they're going to torture my family to death. So I'm not going to grass them up because they're too dangerous. I'm going to grass up that muppet who hasn't got the backing and isn't likely to do that. So it's created a transaction. It created a transactional system where violence is what keeps you in the game. Because if you're the most ruthless and scary gangster, for want of a better word, you're the person that doesn't get grassed up in that situation. So I know I'm jumping around a little bit around the topic here, but I think it's important to set the scene of what exactly it is which makes organised crime perpetually increase its violence and ruthlessness and reputation building. It's because of this, the methods by which police investigate drugs, organised crime in the prohibition regime that we have. So we've got perpetually increasing ruthlessness and violence, the perpetual development of monopolies and cooperatives, and an ever more efficient drug market, all not just because of prohibition, but because we police prohibition and we're constantly refining it. So what this means in terms of the context of the climate crisis is that organised crime have much more power than they used to. Now, if you are seeking to have corrupt assets, it is much more cost effective once you can afford it, once you have a monopoly and you've got that disposable income. It's much more cost effective to corrupt as far up the pyramid as you can. So it is much more cost effective to take over a government minister, or in fact an entire government, than it is to corrupt individual customs officials or police chiefs or the head of the Navy or whatever it is. So we have now the growth of narco states. Now, some people find narco states an unfortunate term, and I suppose it is really. I think the drug policy dialogue is littered with unfortunate terms, but it's still an important term because it's true, and it's an important term because the opposition to what I'm saying, our staunch prohibitionists who have very loud voices, do not like us to refer to narco states because they want to say that it is all of the illicit economies taken together which causes corruption. It's not just the drug markets. And that if the drug markets were taken over and made legal and we had legal regulation, our opposition claimed that we would still have corruption and states would still be corrupted and it wouldn't make any difference. So they're taking their argument sort of tries to take the urgency out of this drug policy debate. But that's bollocks. It is genuinely bollocks because there isn't the money in any of the other illicit economies that can hollow out an entire state and capture the state. There just isn't. And it's important to say that. So much as many people don't like the term narco states, I think it's an important one to hold on to. We have many narco states now. In West Africa, which is the important landing point and distribution point in worldwide cocaine trafficking from across the Atlantic, we have many narco states. Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, part of Ghana has been hollowed out, although there are some fantastic politicians in Ghana. There are much of West Africa has been hollowed out by international organized crime, by transnational organized crime. And then to put it into context, those super cartels in Mexico, as I've said, have got a bigger GDP than most West African countries. So we can see through inequality that this capture is easier in some places than others. But we have many other narco states, Honduras, Guatemala to a degree. And we're watching almost on a weekly basis the destruction of Ecuador, the hollowing out of Ecuador's democracy by design, by organized crime. They've decided to do this to make the cocaine trafficking system more efficient, but not just the cocaine trafficking situation, but also to allow the environmental crime that I'm now going to describe to you how this is all linked. The National Crime Agency in the UK published some remarkable documents called the Strategic Assessment into Organised Crime. Now, these documents really are brilliantly researched, amazingly presented, and again, sometimes quite surprising for how far they go with what they share with the public. In two of the more recent strategic assessment documents, the National Crime Agency make the point that the money in the illicit drug markets is routinely reinvested into other forms of organised criminality, such as people trafficking, organised fraud, lots of other things. Another way of framing that is that the illicit drug markets, the value in the illicit drug markets makes other forms of organised criminality possible, makes it possible. Because if you want to start a business, you need startup capital. You need to spend. The illicit drug markets is vastly the most important business for organised crime. It's what gave birth to organised crime. It's why we have organised crime. It's what makes organised crime possible. But it's also the investment bank for organised crime to do other things. And what this means for the environment is that organised crime commit environmental crime. And the money that they use to investment to do that is from the illicit drug markets. There are multiple reasons why it is worth a lot to organised crime to do that. So one of which is the fact that the money from the illicit drug market is reinvested and it's laundered. It's also laundered. So one of the easiest ways for organised crime to launder money is through the illegal logging market, because you can't trace wood. The wood market is opaque. So they can increase their profits and hide their money. Similarly, they invest in illegal mining, illegal fishing. They double up or triple up their money investments when they're with the illegal logging by also land capture, and they use that land then for illegal ranching. Extra ways they can launder money, and this is what's happening. It's not just the capacity in terms of their wealth that allows them to do this. It's also the fact that they've invested in corruption. Because if you've captured state systems with the value in the illicit drugs market, you've already purchased your corruption, you've already bought it, which means that you can do anything else you want, which means that all of the other crimes that they do, the environmental crimes, are more possible because they've already corrupted the systems, which allows them to do it, because they've paid for that corruption already. There isn't enough money in illegal gold mining to capture a state to create the blanket corruption which allows for the other crimes. There isn't enough money in cattle ranching to capture a government to allow for all of these other crimes to happen. So the starting point always all comes down to drug policy. It's the starting point. Now, the opposition, many police, when I speak to police audiences, much of the opposition to this will say that organised crime will always still do things. They're always going to find crime to do. They're bad people. Of course, they're always going to do criminal stuff. But the greatest misunderstanding about crime is that it's caused by criminals. It's not. It's caused by opportunity. The greatest opportunity for crime in the history of humankind is prohibition. Or to quote Ian Fleming, prohibition is the mother of crime. So in a broader drug policy sense, as well as in terms of the environment, if we were to legally regulate all of the drug markets, we would cripple organised crime twice. And this is very important to understand. We take their biggest business away from them. We snatch their livelihood out of their pockets. But we also prevent them from committing the secondary crimes which require that investment. So we cripple them twice if we take those markets away from them. Now, this is absolutely crucial for the climate crisis because later this year, many of the world's United Nations members will attend the COP. Probably almost all of them will attend the COP in Brazil. It's very perhaps important that it is in Brazil this year, and they will sign the next deforestation treaty, like they signed one at the last COP and the one in Scotland. But the trouble is that signature means nothing if you don't control your own backyard. And this is great frustration because media, journalism, environmental journalists who I try and talk to will cover the treaties and the pros and cons of the details of the treaties and who's signed and who's been difficult. And they will not look further. Well, they might, because the coalition of which I'm a member is working very hard to try and influence people's thinking in this regard. But for the most part, the questions won't be asked because a treaty is meaningless unless you can enact the decisions that have formed that treaty. The most important thing to tackle the climate crisis and to have climate justice is good governance, the ability to act on what needs to be done. And organized crime, drugs, organized crime has become so powerful that on local, regional, and national levels, they control the governance in some of the most sensitive and important parts of the world. Because it just so happens that the Great Green Band, which goes around the equator, that is the most important region for the sake of our planet's future, is also the areas where the main plant-based drugs are grown and trafficked. And the power of organized crime is the strongest. I could give many examples of how the corruption has played out, but I'll give one in Brazil because the COP is in Brazil this year. Just last year, there were floods, disastrous floods in Brazil, and there was no emergency funds to cope with that. There was nothing done because there was no money. The reason there was no money is because the government money that had been allocated to such things had been spent during the Bolsonaro regime on a big road through the Amazon. Big road. Now, it was sold by the government. They said it was to encourage tourism. This road doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't go anywhere. And it's only used for the trafficking of cocaine. It's made it much faster to transport, much more efficient. The trafficking of cocaine and illegal logging. It's all it's used for. It's a big road. And all of the state's resources were spent on this road. It only serves organized crime. It doesn't serve anybody else. I speak in many different venues. Some of the places I'll be speaking at this year, for example, I'll be at the International Policing Conference in Dubai. I'm quite shocked to be invited to go to that one. It's quite a conservative affair. It'll be going a little bit into the lion's den. I'm speaking at all sorts of places. I'm speaking at a psychedelic conference. I love doing psychedelic conferences. I'm speaking at a psychedelic conference called Breaking Convention in April. Lots and lots of conferences, lots of different events. And I'll be explaining these these things in the terms that I think is best suited for the audience. But it's a frustration that in places, for example, like Breaking Convention, and now I love the psychedelic community, and I'm always pleased. That's why I'm especially pleased to say yes to the request of Pam to speak to you all. I love the psychedelic community. You tend to find the smart people in the psychedelic community. It's true. But there is an really annoying exceptionalism, psychedelic exceptionalism within the psychedelic movement. And what I say to psychedelic audiences generally, and I'm about to say it again, is the most important drug for the sake of the planet, the future of the planet, isn't psychedelics. It's cocaine. Of all the drugs, I mean, all the drugs, we need to take control away from organized crime. We need to legally regulate for the sake of people's health, to save lives, to reduce the power of organized crime, yes, but the most important of those drugs is cocaine because of the value, because of the return on investment, the markup on it. It's the drug that makes organized crime the most powerful. And it is the drug which is fueling the corruption in some of the most sensitive and important parts of the planet. Which means that we have to ditch any sense of exceptionalism, and we have to be one movement. So I started this talk by saying that we need to become one movement with the environmental activists, our comrades who are working on climate activism. So I would ask you all, please, wherever your connections may be, whether they are direct or first or second hand, please disseminate this information, bring them to the coalition. We need to become one movement. But that's a grand ambition. But we also need to become one movement within any of us, however, whatever our place is within the drug law, drug policy reform movement, whether we champion psychedelics or whether our drug of choice that we champion is cannabis, whatever, we have to become one solid movement and drop the exceptionalism. Because, if someone's drug of choice is an opioid, then that's their cognitive liberty. And cognitive liberty has to apply to every single human and every single substance that they choose to take for the sake of their own mind and their own body. And only by seeing the movement as a whole can we really be effective as a movement. And we have to become more effective because this is urgent. Now, I'm sorry to be the voice of doom. I know I'm giving some very it's big, it's an intense and depressing thought. But I'm an activist, so I'm an optimist. I have to be. We have to be optimists, and there are things that are happening and things that we can do. And perhaps I'll leave that for what takes shape out of the questions. Maybe some of the questions will be what I can explain what the coalition is doing and what's next, and maybe I'll learn from. Well, I'm sure I will learn from some of the questions and some of the points that will now come out of any discussion. So, thank you so much for listening to me so far, and I look forward to see if it's prompted any questions. So, thank you.
Thanks, Neil. It's always good to hear how you weave it all together and bring in so much of your life experience and waking up, seeing what was right in front of you and waking up and putting it all together and really bringing it here. I think a lot of things you've said today are probably new to some folks, and we're wondering, how is this all going to tie in? Can you just go through one more time, just really explicitly, the money's coming from and what they're doing with the money and why this matters to the climate? Just tie that one more time in there for everyone. And
okay, so the power of organized crime has got so big that they are now as big as or bigger than some state actors. They are more powerful than individual governments, and they're using that power to corrupt other governments to make their business more efficient. What that means is those people don't give a shit about the climate crisis. So the corruption is so much that governments that want to do something to stop deforestation, to comply with their obligations to the treaties, they can't, because they don't control their own backyard. They don't control their own forest. The mafia controls the Amazon, not the Brazilian government. Governments aren't in control, and we need to face up to this fact. I'll give you an example. In West Africa, in April 2021, Guinea had been a military dictatorship, and they got a democratic government for the first time in a long time. Almost immediately, that democratically elected government declared that they were going to comply with their international obligations and stop deforestation. They were stopping it. Environmental activists worldwide cheered as an example of the positive things that can happen from democracy. It was celebrated. By September, there had been a military coup paid for by drugs organized crime, and immediately the deforestation began again, and almost immediately became the fastest deforestation for any nation in the world. And that was because it suited organized crime to launder their money through deforestation in Guinea. That's just one example of many. It's a very one that you can actually focus in on and say, this happened. This is happening all over. We're in this sort of daydream, or rather, the general public who care, the ones who actually pay attention, are in a daydream that the COP can have big impacts because there is so much media impact, focus on what happens, but no one's looking beyond that. Oh, okay, this government signed that treaty. Do they have the capacity to enact that government? And they don't, because organized crime, the drug markets, have corrupted their systems. Now, there are other ways in which drug prohibition intersects with the climate crisis. I've spoken on my specialism within the coalition. There are other specialisms. For example, one basic fact is that where the police will aerial spray a coca plantation, it means that organized crime will just move further into sensitive areas. You're spreading it out. You're like putting petrol on a fire, and it spreads. By chasing organized crime, you're never reducing the size of the market. So they'll just go into more difficult areas and more sensitive areas, and then they've damaged not just one spot. Well, you've aerial sprayed that with glyphosate. That's damaged. Now they're going to damage another spot and another and another, and it grows and it grows and it goes on and on and on because it's a constant battle. To quote The Wire again, this war on drugs, it ain't no war because wars end. This isn't ending; it's just perpetual damage. So there are other intersections between the way that we police prohibition and the climate crisis as well. It's just from my point of view, the corruption issue is the most important. But how do we empower poorer countries to do what we need to do when our policy, created by the global north, is destroying their government? We've caused this. We've done this by our global policy.
So we have a question here too, but I'll preamble it. What percentage of your colleagues, so you're in the UK, and I know you're speaking, I think you're going to be speaking at a conference in Canada soon. What percentage of law enforcement personnel do you feel they've got this? Maybe they don't know how to act. Maybe they don't know what to do yet, or how they can, work in these two worlds of knowing something, but still having, a system approach the law. How many of your colleagues do you think knew this? And how many do you think generally understand this?
Well, in terms of the intersection with the climate crisis, there are very few people on the planet know this at the moment. The people who know this are the people who have listened to any of us from the coalition speak, because it's that cutting edge. No one else is working on this other than the coalition. It's new. It's genuinely new thinking. I'm hoping that for example, the first time we did an event on this was 3 years ago at the UN, and there was only our event. This year, I'm doing an event on corruption, and there's various coalition members now doing things. I think we have 12 events at the UN. So it is it's taking off, and people are listening. But to ask about policing, well, that's a difficult question, because if you're asking me how many police are aware that drug prohibition doesn't work and the war on drugs is a catastrophe, well, certainly it's an increasing number of cops. And the number of police who get it and understand that the war on drugs is only causing harm, that's a rapidly growing number, definitely. There's certainly plenty of cops in Canada know this. I know plenty of police in Canada who understand this very well. The extent of the harms in terms of the climate crisis, that's just not a discussion in policing at all at the moment. That those links aren't understood at all yet. But I'm pleased to say that the movement within policing is growing. So, yeah, I mean, and also it depends on the level of question that you ask. So, if you were to ask any cop, like, can the war on drugs be won? you'd struggle to find any police officer who says yes, it can be won. That we just need to try a bit harder, because they'd be aware of how stupid they would sound by saying that. But there are varying degrees. Most cops will just resign and say, "Yeah, but it's the law. We've got to do it." And most police still believe that attempts at supply reduction policing reduce the size of availability. It's a stubborn. It's still a strong belief system within the strategy of policing, unfortunately. But we're getting there. We're eroding that with the movement. We're breaking that down, and that's why I try and use this specific language, like the size of getting to see things in terms of the size of the market. You have not reduced the size of the market. That's a very important piece of messaging, especially from policing, who have got this cognitive dissonance that they think, arresting a dealer is going to reduce the amount of drugs in circulation. It's like, no. So it's a big question, Pam. I don't know. I'd like to have a guess. I know a friend of mine, Nick Crofts, who is the director of the Law Enforcement and Public Health Association. He thinks that at the moment you can divide police into thirds. There's the third that get it completely, the third that are starting to understand it, and then there's a third which will never get it. So what you have to do is empower the third that get it to educate the third in the middle, and that's how you change the system within policing. So that's his strategic thinking, and it's worthwhile. I'm not quite sure I'm so optimistic that you can divide it into thirds, but I can definitely say that the movement is growing. That is certain.
Yeah, I think I've seen that shift too. I'd like to swing back to that in a bit, but and so this goes into Nelson's question, wondering how do people broach the matter with law enforcement professionals without the conversation becoming adversarial if they don't share the view. So I'll read the rest of the question. They don't, he mentions, I don't judge them for holding perspective. I used to share it, but I don't know how to talk about it without getting their backs up about the work that they do every day.
Well, one way of doing it is to, it always depends on how much conversation you've got. If you've only got a small interaction, then it changes. If you've got the opportunity to actually sit down and have a long conversation, then I would say that one way of bringing it up is that, did you know that there is a growing international movement of police who are actually advocating for an end to this war on drugs? They're centered around this fantastic organization called LEAP. It's in the USA, and they've got like loads of members all over the world. There's this cop in the UK who talks on this topic. Have you heard of them? It's like amazing. And what do you think? Do you think you can win the war on drugs? And it's like, that's one way of doing it, introducing them to the fact that there is a growing movement. And actually, that is the most useful way that we win over police, is that where cops have doubts and growing doubts, they feel like they've got support from peers, and then they're not on their own. And that is important, that they've got a support structure potentially, and people, and a website that they can refer to, and peers that can help them to allow their thoughts to take shape, and also that they've got peers who understand the pressures of policing, and the drive, because a lot of cops can be very driven, and they can be driven because they want to solve a problem, and they think they've been given the tools to do it. But to coin a much used phrase, unfortunately, with policing, every problem can look like a nail that you need to hammer. But police understand those kind of metaphors, and increasingly police also understand that there are public health solutions to policing problems. It's actually a growth type of thinking within policing, this public health approach, especially for violence reduction. And quite often that's the route in to win cops over on drug policy, because they already understand public health solutions to other problems. So those are some of the ways that you can engage with cops. But I think the most important thing is for them to realize, because many police don't realize that there's a growing movement to end prohibition. Many of them don't realize, and many of them are nervous to actually voice their own doubts and their own concerns. But also, I think it's worth bearing in mind that PTSD is a massive problem within policing, but so is moral injury. And most, in fact, all of the cops that I've spoken with about moral injury, it's all been from drugs policing, all of it, because that's where police are breaching their own ethical centres, because drugs policing causes harm to vulnerable people, and this is contrary to many people's ethical centre, and that's where you get the injury, the moral injury, because it's a you're doing something which is morally wrong, and part of you knows this, and that can be an interesting discussion. But of course, I think you'd have to test the water to sort of see the philosophical capacity of the individual before you jumped into that one.
And I think too, in Canada, I think there is a large component of police officers that understand this very clearly. I know in our program that we run in the nonprofit Roots to Thrive, we have a lot of retired police officers that come through for psychedelic therapy for their PTSD.
Yeah.
Because now they're retired and now they can they're really seeking, a healthy life. How do I overcome what I've seen and what I've experienced and what I've had to deal with and maybe even shoved down to be effective in my job? And now they're really going, I need to feel better, and they're feeling better. And Larry Campbell, who was a former police officer and was a coroner, and so saw the impact of drugs, as from the coroner's point of view, saw the impact of drugs from a police officer, then went on to be the mayor of Vancouver, saw it from a political standpoint, and then went on to be a senator at the federal level, and fully gets it, speaks out. And I think when you have people like that look like, the old, tough, big, burly cop, saying, this is medicine, this is helpful, and this has helped me and others, and this should not be illegal. So I think there's a huge movement, and often sometimes it's there's way more acceptance of it, and often it just takes people really just speaking out and saying it, and
absolutely,
opening the doors for others to step forward and say, these are medicines, and going back to like cognitive liberty, like you said, that people should.
I should add to that a little bit. That actually, I should make the point that actually Canada is the most important nation on earth in terms of the influence of police, but by some considerable way. Now, I know police have been criticised, and rightfully criticised, for the way that some of the policing practices undermined the attempt to decriminalise in British Columbia. And it's true. But generally, the movement within police in terms of how that is understood is much more advanced in Canada than anywhere else. And the fact that those discussions are happening is important for the whole world. So, wherever those changes of mind and changes of heart are happening, that needs to be nurtured and encouraged and spread wherever possible, really, because Canada's leading the way with that thinking from a policing perspective.
And what I love about what you said earlier too is, it's really the relational part. It's really about having these conversations at the level of appreciating that everyone's just a person, and opening up the heart and talking from the level of the heart and the kindness of course, which, psychedelics for many of us has allowed us to be much kinder, much more thoughtful, much more intellectual, much more collaborative and curious, and less confrontational, which is what we really need right now. So being able to foster these wonderful communications, even if we don't agree, we can be different, but we don't have to be separate, which is a beautiful quote from an elder, a Blackfeet elder that does some teaching here in Canada, and we have his permission to share that quote. But I have a few more things I want to ask, but there is another question here: is how do you manage PTSD while advocating for this cause so deeply tied to your personal experience?
This is public, isn't it? Potentially.
It is, and we can cut this out. Or we can not answer it. I can go to the next question.
Yeah, I can't.
Next
I can't really go into too much detail there. But Well, there are many ways, and I'm sure my sudden silence has given you a strong hint of some of the things that help. Um, but there are other ways as well, and I suppose becoming an activist has been one of the things that's helped me because um, it's not so much a redemptive sort of thing, but it's just the feeling that I am doing something about it. I'm doing something positive. You know, I've got so many near death experiences. My complex PTSD is complex. It's so multi layered. Um, I actually I had a bit of a weird, an uncomfortable PTSD revelation in this last week. It's PTSD. It's the gift that just keeps giving, and it's because I was asked to speak in this talk in this particular event on because these lots of the students were strong police abolitionists, and so I was asked by this lecturer to cover some aspects to talk about abolitionist theory. And to do that, I decided to talk about two events that happened to me before I got into undercover drugs policing, and one of which was the first road traffic accident I came across with my tutor when I was still very young in the service at 19, where it was a car that crashed into a wall, 85 miles an hour. It was smoking, it was hot, and there was petrol pouring out. And I had to drag this man out, and he clearly died in my arms. And and I remember thinking I might die here. I can smell the petrol. But it was the first time it really occurred to me, well, this is my job. My duty is to stay here and cope with this danger of this petrol to try and save this person's life. It's my job. And then another time was a few weeks later, one of the few first times I was allowed out on my own. I was in the city of Derby, going from the east side of the city into the centre. And I heard a message on the radio which said all Derby East units switched to Central. I thought that's a weird thing. So I went onto the Central channel and all hell had broken loose. There'd been a terrorist bomb in the army recruiting headquarters in the city. It was not the IRA, it was the INLA, and they'd set this bomb off. And as I heard that, I realized I was 20 seconds away from where the bomb had gone. So I changed direction, went to the shopping area where it was, got out the car, and I started running towards it. It's like a big mushroom cloud, big clouds of debris, and another cop came from the other side of the city centre. We're both running towards it, and there are people screaming, there are people running away, and I realised there might be a second device because that's what they do. They wait for cops to get there and blow up, and I'm thinking, but it's my job to run towards it. And so these were the first two things that made me think that this is my duty, and it was the weight of that because I'd been quite flippant about going into policing, to be honest, but literally flippant. I flipped a coin, but this sense of duty absolutely gripped me at that point. Anyway, I wanted to make that point in this lecture, talking about abolitionism, because the point is that drug policy has ruined policing. That's what needs to change. You're still going to need people who run towards the danger while other people need to run away. You're always going to need someone to do that. And so I wanted to do this. But what I discovered when I was thinking about this and preparing for this lecture was that those things had traumatized me. And it had never occurred to me at all, never occurred to me that those were some of my layers for my PTSD, because I'd always thought everything came from my undercover work, everything came from the moral injury. But so it cost me some real sleep. I was having, trying to sleep. I was breathing at the top of my lungs. My body was trying to put me into fight or flight, which was, it was useful for me to understand these things. But it's been a really bloody difficult week of missed sleep, So, but I think that I'm probably a lengthier answer than someone was expecting, but I still have a sense of duty, and I think a sense of duty has become important to me, and so I am driven still by that sense of duty, that I have a responsibility to share my understanding to try and make things better, and that remains my duty as much as my duty existed when that terrorist bomb went off, or whatever. It remains the same. And so that's a very centering thing for me, I think. And it allows me to cope with the really difficult times, really, really difficult. And I do have some difficult times that I remember I can get through that anxiety. I can get through that struggle to stop my body going into fight or flight because I've got that mission, okay, I can center myself. I know who I am. I know who I am. That's important. And I know that I can do the best I can do to try and make things better. And so, I mean, I suppose that's psychedelic thinking, really. But I hope that answers the question.
I think it does. And thank you for reminding us, and thank you for the work you've done. Thank you for reminding us that you are, you and other first responders, firefighters, paramedics, police officers are running towards and doing that when others are having, the privilege of running away, you're running towards. And that's really important work. And thank you for that. You talked about, I'm going to combine another question with the question I have, so bear with me. So there's a lot of interest in not, removing prohibition. There's a lot of people beyond organized crime that benefit from prohibition, right? So there's a lot you can chew on here, our go-to, but not only do we have organized crime that clearly is benefiting, and that whole lineage of who's in that, and the corruption of whoever's receiving, the payoffs in government and politics. And if you look at, especially to our friends to the south in the US, I mean, they have private prisons, which benefit enormously from incarceration, and benefit enormously from incarcerating certain people more than others, where you have, even in Canada, like every drug policy Canada's ever had, Neil Boyd, professor of criminology, speaks prolifically on this, written a number of books, but every criminalization of any medicine, drug, whatever word you want to use, has been from a racist background. The sentences for cocaine in the US are much lighter than crack. There's way more people in prison in the US for crack than there are for cocaine. And the color of your skin directly influences the likelihood of incarceration. So there's, there's the elements of cultural control, of racism. There's also there's, like I said, the huge benefit from the prison industrial complex in the US. Like, it's mind-boggling that there's private prisons. What a conflict of interest. And then you have and so there, I'm going to toss that to you. And so why, when this is so obvious, why what is holding our elected representatives in Canada, the UK, the US back from doing the right thing, making the obvious choice, which would be to remove prohibition and treat this like a public health, or like in the healthcare system? And as well was why not governments in the countries that are highly being affected, in the Amazon or in Central America or South America? Why not just a mass decriminalization or legalization?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's many things going on there, and there's many reasons why. For some, if you look at it in simple terms, simple political terms, drug prohibition is a very useful way of bashing your opponents. There's a sort of infamous leaflet, just to have a little snapshot example of a broader issue. In the 2014 general election in the UK, the Labour Party published a leaflet criticising the Liberal Democrats who had just published a policy that they recommended the legal regulation of cannabis. They published this leaflet, the Lib Dems, soft on drugs. And that was what they used. And it's a very useful way to bash your opponents. We are tougher than they are softer than us. And that's a very common pattern within politics around the world. So you get big political parties competing who can be the toughest. And it's always the problem. It's always the thing, isn't it? You got a problem, who can be the toughest on it. And that's a simple message. It's an easier message to put out there. But it's not just cynical political messaging and cynical political views that use prohibition to their advantage. It's also the sort of feedback loops that you have between police, media, and politics, because the for most places the problem is public opinion. The public don't understand, and the public have for a long time suffered intense propaganda to make them believe that the current drug policy is the correct one, and and they've the popular media, fiction, news has demonized people who use drugs as the enemy that need to be solved or dealt with. And what I mean by a feedback loop is, and the policing is very much part of this feedback loop. The police are constantly telling us what a good job they've done within the drug policy. They are constantly showing us the big pile of drugs, the dope on the table, to quote The Wire for the third time today, dope on the table. And it's constantly these images of the dope on the table, the row of mugshots that you see on the front of a newspaper or behind the newsreader. These are powerful images that are being repeated over and over. These are marketable images that have multi-layered impacts on the public. And what these images say is that the police are doing something and that clearly the system works, because look at that big pile of drugs. The system must work. Look at this gang that they've caught. Oh, that gang did terrible things. The police are doing a great job at catching these horrible people who do these horrible things. But what the police put out in the press, and worryingly, policing agencies are increasingly more sophisticated on social media as well. These are very powerful images. And the subtext is the current system works. Now, the problem is that what the police are saying is dishonest, because it's out of context. The question should be, from anyone who works in media out there, that the questions are not being asked that need to be asked. And the questions are, okay, officer, it's a very impressive pile of cocaine. Do you have any evidence that this will reduce crime? Do you have any evidence that this will actually reduce the market? What do you mean, officer, that you've disrupted the market? What does disruption mean? Surely disruption is the way to market growth and market opportunity, officer. It's that these kind of questions need to be asked to unpick it, because what happens is, and I've just done a lot of media in December. I did a lot of media in Malaysia, and I spoke to some of the news editors, and they were when I was suggesting to them that the news editors develop a policy of questioning the police in the ways that I was suggesting, they were incredibly nervous. They said, because we can't start questioning the police like that, because we get blackballed. We won't be able to operate, because we'll get sidelined or we can lose our jobs. So in some countries, you can't ask the police those questions, but where you can ask the police those questions, we have a duty to do so, because it breaks one of the feedback loops. Because as it stands, the media accepts what's presented. The media accepts that this evidence is evidence of something positive, and this is reinforcing the view of the public. Now, to be fair to many politicians, they are forming their opinions and their policies on what they perceive to be public opinion. Now, that's the way democracy works. So you can't really necessarily criticize a politician in that regard. I mean, I can quote Tony Benn, one of my favorite politicians in the UK. He came out with this great phrase that politicians are either signposts or they are weather vanes. They either show the way from the point of leadership or they follow the way the voting public go. He disdainfully dismissed the majority of politicians as weather vanes, but that's what we have to work with. So the secret really is the growth of the social movement to influence the public. It is therefore more important, actually, than political advocacy trying to change the politician's view. And we can change public opinion by the growth of the movement, but also these mechanisms by looking at where the feedback loops come from and where we can interrupt those. And I would argue that the most important of those is actually what the police are saying and that inherent dishonesty in it. But there are there are many other aspects to it as well. You know, even drama creators who will demonize the cartel leader in the string vest and the moustache, and you know, all of these tropes that are repeated over and over. We need to break this. And actually, I'm guilty of adding to the stigma of the drug dealer, because I tell these stories of gangsters and how evil and nasty these gangsters have been. Actually, the vast majority of drug dealers I've ever met have been lovely people who are just uh, who are just doing a community service, and they're part of their community. There are dark elements to organized crime which are, but one problem that I wrestle with is I'm adding to the stigma. And you know, one thing the movement needs to do is to actually reduce the stigma of who a drug dealer is as well. Because that's one of the tropes that scares the public, scares them, and the public who form an opinion from fear can be manipulated by particularly authoritarian politicians.
And that what you're saying there too is, you know, this trope of what a drug dealer is, but there's also the trope of what a drug user is.
Yeah.
You know, and this ties into the work of Dr. Carl Hart at the University of Chicago. I mean, you guys are speaking the same language. You know, cognitive liberty. You know, everybody should have the right to have access to alter how they wish. You know, and that's kind of similar here too, that we have weighted in a puritanical way of that some things have value and some things don't. And you know, it's quite acceptable to go home and have 6 scotches, but if you want to go,
exactly.
If you want to go home in the safety of your own home and have a heroin journey on your couch, it's a different thing, but it's not really.
Yeah, I agree. I should clarify that I am keen on the cognitive liberty argument, and I mean I love Carl. I've enjoyed his company. Carl is I'm a big fan of his. Where I disagree with Carl is that should be the whole of the argument and the central point of the argument, because it's important for us who are active to understand who our audience is and what argument they are ready for, because some arguments will shut them down rather than get them interested. And one of those arguments that is really difficult for some audiences is the cognitive liberty one.
And swinging back to something else, and I have another question here that I'll ask you, but there's also this belief system, maybe, you know, this bias we have maybe in Canada is that, oh, we're not as corrupt as other countries like, you know, Mexico and the reality is in Canada before cannabis became medicalized and then legalized, is the biggest contributor to advocacy groups against legalization of cannabis was coming from organized crime, you know, and that was uncovered that, you know, Mothers Against Drugs was being funded by the Hells Angels. And so we're equally susceptible. And that again is a transparency thing that we need, is show us the money. Where's the money coming from to support, you know, the advocacy against something?
That's actually an incredibly important fact. That's an amazing piece of storytelling, which is important for our movement. That Mothers Against Drugs and the organized crime connection. That's really powerful. And you know, any media experts out there, if there's a way of presenting that in a package, is really be, you know, that's an important story that would have great influence, I would say.
And so on that, we were asked about one more question here, and then we'll start wrapping it up. That why do you think the governments with deep cartel connections like Mexico have yet to decriminalize cocaine or decriminalize anything?
Well, there's multiple reasons, and one of which, of course, is as we've been talking about, the influence of organized crime, but also there's a strong political sense that nations are stuck with the policy regime that we have, because the single conventions, the drug treaties, international drug treaties, are incredibly powerful. There are automatic sanctions built into those treaties. There aren't automatic sanctions built into the genocide treaty, and the drug single conventions It's the only one that actually uses the word evil. They didn't use the word evil for genocide, but they used the word evil for drugs in the single convention. So it's really difficult to unpick. I'm not an activist who believes that we should be spending too much time in actually engaging with the UN to try and change this, because that's just a fool's errand in my regard. But my organization does side events at the UN because we can attract journalist attention to it more than we do it to engage with the UN. But many nations, to varying political degrees, don't even believe they can change their drug laws because of those treaties. But actually, every single nation is entitled to experiment with regulation under those treaties, every nation. And in fact, Switzerland is hopefully about to put together a cocaine regulation experiment. The mayor of Amsterdam in the Netherlands wants to do one in the Netherlands, a cocaine regulation experiment. You can do this. And of course, but now we know that the Pandora's box is open with those treaties because the USA broke them first and they're the architect of that treaty. But politically, it's taking a while to realize that, the rules have been torn up. They have been torn up, but it's a slow oil tanker of a political process to get engagement to do so. But thankfully, we do have incredible politicians like former President Ruth Dreyfus in Switzerland, who are leading on the drive to get experiments in place, regulation experiments.
In Canada, I mean, Canada broke it too, and with cannabis, and there was no consequence other than fantastic tourism.
Yeah, so, exactly right.
Yeah. So GDP with tourism went up. So fantastic. Well, Neil, thank you so much. We put your resources in the chat. Follow Neil. I'm going to say a few things. I'm going to give the last words to Neil here in a moment, but thank you everyone who joined us. Please become a member. That helps support the Psychedelic Association of Canada. 99% volunteer driven. So your money's going to go to more stuff like this, more webinars, and you get access to perks. Like there's a book club that goes and reads great books together where people meet and form community and talk around the book, and the authors usually come and join us. We have meditation workshops, a whole bunch of things in there. Great connections, community events, and we have another webinar coming up in about a month on sense and psyche. So sense and the psychedelic experience. So that'll be a great one. I know the speaker for that. He's fantastic. And to you, Neil, to you, the last words. So first, you have a magic wand. What would you do first with that? And where can people find you next? Other than the resources, where are you talking next and where can they find you?
Okay, well, if I had a magic wand and if I couldn't just have all of the policy changes I wanted immediately, I would start with the safe supply in the opioid space. That's the most important. That's the most crucial thing in all of the drug policy issues. Safe supply. The British system, as it was, that anyone who develops substance use disorder should have a safe access to that drug to keep them safe, to save them from the exploitation of organized crime, and to give them the space to decide what they want to do next, because it's got to be up to them. Always. So that's the first thing I would do in a big long shopping list of drug policy changes. That's the first thing I would do. I didn't send you the links to my books. If anyone wants to know some more undercover stories or my drug policy book, I've published a couple of books if you're interested in those. Where am I speaking next? Oh God. I mentioned Breaking Convention in the UK. I should be at the Harm Reduction International Conference in Bogota in April. Although I'm not sure if the funding's come through for that. I'm meant to be speaking there. We will see. I'm doing the LEPH conference, and I'm partly organising the drug policy satellite meeting for the LEPH conference in Ottawa in July. That's going to be important because we're trying to bring police voices to challenge the rowing back of the attack of harm reduction in Canada, essentially. So we're seeing what we can do with that. So if anyone knows anybody who might be interested in that and help us organise it, take part, whatever, you will be welcome. Trying to think what else I'm doing. I'm speaking at the Dubai International Police Conference on mental health actually. So I'm doing 2 slots in that. I'm going into the Lion's Den and the in an anti-narcotics panel, but I'm also doing a session on mental health in policing, and I will be making reference to because one of the things I'm trying to do is to get police leaders to demand access to psychedelic therapy. So it's a challenge to do that in Dubai, I think, but I'm going to give it a go. Um, and to reiterate the thing that I said earlier on, if you know anyone who works with Greenpeace or any of the World Wildlife Fund, please send them our way. The coalition needs to grow. It needs to grow rapidly. You've got the link to the website. I can put you in touch with Clemmy, and Clemmy can get you connected to the coalition if you're that way inclined. Thank you. And thanks, Pam. Always
Brilliant.
good.
Brilliant. So thank you for, I didn't give you the last word. Sorry, I'm grabbing it back. Awesome. Thank you for joining us. It's been brilliant. I'm so glad people are going to hear what you have to say. We are going to get all those resources in the show notes when the video is released, and keep us informed on what you're doing, and we'll make sure we'll have you back so you can update us. And thank you for being a leader in this. It's, I really appreciate what you're doing. I really appreciate that you're leading the way and you're giving us ideas. So thank you so much, and now you can go to bed. It's very late and it's time for you to go to bed. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Pam. Good to see you.
Until next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.